what are we? What is ERCOT? Well, you can't really describe it until you first look at the ERCOT grid. So we are a little grid wedged between two very large grids in the United States and Canada. Little, we're 71,000 megawatts, but that's small compared to the other two. And we're an island. We can trade power through DC ties, which are kind of like valves that you can shut on and off, but in a very limited way. We've got about, I guess, what is it, 1,250 megawatts. We use those for both import and export of power. We've figured out a way to integrate them into our markets. But the truth of the matter is if our grid gets in trouble or one of the other grids, and there's also, we have some DC ties with Mexico, if any of them get in trouble, we can't help each other out very much with 1,250 megawatts of DC ties. So we're an island. One of the reasons that that's important is that we're all in the boundaries of one state, which means we are not, our markets are not jurisdictional to the federal government. We are not a FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory, boy, there's the first acronym, somebody throw something at me. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they do not have jurisdiction over our markets. So what we are in a legal sense is an independent system operator, and we have actually been that for a good number of years, over 20 years, but the ISOs, and we have one of them is called an RTO, a Regional Transmission Organization, which is the PJM interconnection over there in the kind of the maroon, have really existed as we know them since around the turn of the century. And we share a lot of things in common, but mainly what we do is we operate our grids at the bulk electric system level, which is 69,000 volts and up. We don't really have any jurisdiction over the distribution system, which is what's causing the lights to be on here right now. So ERCOT, as we know it today, exists because of the 1999 Texas State Legislature, and which set in motion a series of major market changes that took effect on January 1st, 2002. They created an entity called the Independent Organization, and then they assigned, the PUC assigned those tasks to us. So basically what we do is we do transmission planning. People say, hey, what do you do? Can you describe ERCOT in one sentence? And if I had to do that, I would say we keep the grid reliable and we operate the grid and keep it reliable using market-based solutions whenever possible. Those last two words are kind of important because sometimes we can't depend on the markets to do it. But that's really, if you have to sum it up in one sentence, that's what we do. Within those markets, there are a bunch of things, and they're listed there, and I'm going to talk about a few of them tonight. But we really are all about trying to find the lowest cost solution through market-based methods. We also settle the market. We are the registrar for the retail market, which covers the vast majority, or covers about 3/4 of the state, all the old investor-owned utilities. Does not include Austin, does not include San Antonio, does not include Pedernales Electric or Blue Bond Electric. So you're in a pocket here where the competitive choice doesn't really apply. This is a list of data. We had a biblical year of drought and heat in 2011, and we set most of these records then, but we have since finally caught up with 2011 last year and this year, and we've started breaking grid demand records since then. We broke, let's see, our June record still stands from 2012, but we set a July record last year. We broke the record, the all-time record for the ERCOT grid this summer, just about a month and a half ago, and we broke our all-time September record a couple of weeks ago. We've also broke our wind record. We'll talk about wind here in a minute. We have an enormous amount of wind generation on our system, as you all have probably heard. We at one time, for a brief period, at 1:10 in the morning on March 23rd, we're serving nearly half of our load with wind energy. And let's see, what else is useful there? A weekend load at 67,000 megawatts. That would have been almost unheard of a few years ago. So a lot of things happening. This is a slide that I've people have associated with me, and I can't really take credit for it, but I do. This is a comparison of two 15-minute intervals in the ERCOT grid under radically different weather conditions. So you take March 24th is there on the left, and you can kind of see how the load is distributed, how the generation is being distributed among the different customer classes. So you don't have very much residential air conditioning going at 4:30 in the afternoon when it's 62 degrees in Dallas. But then you fast forward a few months, and you're in the peak interval in August, which, as I mentioned earlier, we broke our generation record on that day, and you're basically your residential load quadruples. So what we really are, what you're really looking at here is weather-sensitive load. It's a big driver of a lot of what we do at ERCOT. We build a lot. A lot of our operations are built around meeting summer peak load. Our generators are on alert always during summer peaks. The transmission system is designed to be at its maximum efficiency during the summer peaking. That's the reason. It's because of residential air conditioning. If we didn't have residential air conditioning, there would probably be about 3 million people in Texas instead of 28 million. And so I took those same 2 days, and I thought I would, I'm not sure this is really relevant, but it kind of shows the difference in the fuel mix of what is serving that load. So if you see the green, you'll notice in March the wind really blows a lot. The wind blows especially in the pre-dawn hours, and that's the green. The blue is the different types of natural gas generation. You got nuclear at the bottom, and the coal is the dark gray. So you can see what is really unusual about this year, and our meteorologist is a friend of mine, and I talk to him regularly, but he has speculated that we have had an unusual amount of wind on the system this summer. And his speculation on this, and he hasn't done the research, but we think it's related to the after effects of the El Nino. Normally, that green band at the top of the peak day on the right would shrink to almost nothing at 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, but we still had 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts of wind on the system. That is a good thing for reliability. So we also have a lot more wind. The wind is famous for not blowing on peak in West Texas, which is where the vast majority of our wind is. But we do have more wind now down on the Gulf Coast, and the Gulf Coast wind is more reliable during the peak hours of the summer. So that's a good thing. Okay, the biggest driver in our markets, though, today is still natural gas, and you all have heard about fracking. You can see that natural gas is priced by the million BTUs. In the summer of 2008, it was selling for well over $12 per MMBTU. It has nosedived, and it perked up a little in 2014, but for the most part, for the last couple of years, it's really been under $3. This has a profound effect on the markets that ERCOT runs. And the reason for the gas plummeting in price is there on the right, and it is, of course, hydraulic fracturing. And we've seen those are all the different shale plays. And these are just a couple of graphs I stole from Energy Information Administration. So we're sitting on an awful lot of gas in the state of Texas that is staying in the ground right now because the prices are so low. It may change. We're going to start exporting gas from the Gulf Coast very soon, and there's a lot of LNG capacity backed up in the pipeline that could come online in the next few years. We start exporting natural gas to the countries where it's more expensive. Learned today that I think it's $15 a million BTUs in Japan today, but I could be corrected on that by my friend Yu over there. So, okay, so this is kind of a one-slide summary of what really was about 5 or 6 years of intense regulatory debate. But we have, ERCOT has this, for now, we are going to survive with what is called an energy-only market. We do not have a market for forward capacity that actually collects money and pays new generation and new other types of resources to come online in future years. We depend on price signals in the energy market to drive the incentives for future investment. So the Commission, Public Utility Commission, which is our jurisdictional regulatory authority, has set in motion this escalating level of system-wide offer caps. And we hit the $9,000 ceiling last year. That's where it stops, at least for now. That means that you can sell power as a generator potentially for as much as $9,000 a megawatt hour, which is $9 a kilowatt hour, considering that most of you can relate to that. We pay about 10, maybe 12 cents a kilowatt hour on average. So the prices have the potential to go very, very high in our market. These are the highest system-wide offer caps in North America. Australia's are higher, but there's nobody in the northern hemisphere, I should say, that even comes close to this. But however, having said all of that, we've never gotten to 9,000. We have cleared 3,000 and 4,000 a few times, but we've never gotten to 9,000, and it's been in effect for 2 summers now. So I just thought this is a kind of a snapshot we put together of what do our energy prices typically look like. It's a scatter graph, and you can see that the vast majority of intervals, they're trading down in the under $50 range. I put kind of a I guess a little table together over there, and you can kind of run the percentages. But out of 35,000 intervals in a year, 406 of them last year, the energy traded at over $75. So that would be $75 would be 7.5 cents a kilowatt hour. So 75 is kind of a cutoff point because that's one of our market products has a minimum price of 75. A few of those, of course, you can see got up into the thousands, but for very short periods of time. Each one of those dots represents 15 minutes. Okay. So this is a look at the fleet. I mentioned that my title was the evolving grid, and I guess this tells the story probably as well as anything in my slide deck. Gas steam units comprised half of the market just a mere 20 years ago. They're almost gone. We're about 15-cent old gas boilers anymore. Combined cycle technology was just coming online in the mid-90s. It's now 36.5% of our fleet. It's the largest component of our generation fleet today. You'll notice wind renewables were less than 1/10%, and they are now a significant percentage of our generation. I'm looking for the wind on there, but I know it's there somewhere. 13.8. The vast majority of that 13.8% is wind. There is a little bit of solar, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. But this is a changing grid, and it's going to continue to change because a lot of those gas steam units that you see there are getting really, really old. A lot of the coal units that you'll see to the right. Not sure why coal is colored green. That's an interesting. Sorry, did you have a question? Sorry?
Is this measured in energy or capacity?
This is measured in nameplate capacity. Yeah, okay. So anyway, you can kind of see we have a lot of aging coal plants and aging gas steam units. They're going to be replaced by more combined cycle, more simple cycle gas peakers because those are very efficient. They can meet peak demand easily, and they can fire up really quickly. But we're going to see some coal go away. Everybody knows that. And the gas steam will continue to decline. So this is our wind, and we are famous for having wind generation, and this kind of shows the development through the years. The big bump occurred around the 2010-2011 legislature when the CREZ projects were authorized by the ledge and then later implemented in rule by the Public Utility Commission, and that's where we really started escalating the wind development. I mentioned the wind does blow a lot more hours of the year in West Texas. It's some of the best wind resource in North America. Consequently, separate country, we'd be number 6 in the world. So that gives you an idea of what we're doing. And there's a lot more coming. The production tax credits were extended by the federal government last year, and they are going to bring us some more wind very shortly. These numbers may already be obsolete for all I know. Same is true with solar. At the same time, the production tax credits for wind were extended. The investment tax credits for solar energy were extended as well. And you can see we've got a good amount of photovoltaic solar in the pipeline. I was actually informed this afternoon by our resource adequacy folks that we are already over 300 megawatts. So this is already out of date a little bit. I put and the darker the red, the further away you get from our transmission grid. So that's going to be a challenge in the future. The solar folks love that dark red, but we don't have any way of getting that power out of West Texas. And they're going to have to prove it out on an economic planning level, which is, could be a challenge. This is actually where the transmission grid sort of resides in relation to the irradiance map. These were the CREZ lines. These were the competitive renewable energy zone transmission lines that were authorized by the ledge and implemented by the Public Utility Commission. You're looking at about, in the dark lines there, the bold lines I should say, about $7 billion worth of transmission. Some of that went all the way up into the Panhandle where we don't even have any ERCOT load. We don't serve, ERCOT grid does not serve any load in the Panhandle. All those are is transmission lines and wind farms that are designed to bring the power down to the load centers, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin. But in the McCamey area, which is kind of, if you guys have ever been out on I-10 out by Fort Stockton, that's where there's an enormous amount of wind there already. That was one of the first and earliest, most popular wind areas. But once you get past like Pecos County, which is where the kind of the end of that line is, we don't have a very robust transmission grid. But that's where the solar potential really starts up. So we'll see how that plays out over the next few years, but that's going to be another evolving part of our grid. I don't have to show you this. Everybody knows solar panels have gone down in price and solar installations have gone up. You know, one of the things that we're concerned about, what you saw a minute ago is grid scale solar, but we are also trying to keep our eye on distributed solar, rooftop solar. It is not coming on as fast in ERCOT as it has, of course, in California and Hawaii and Germany. But it's coming on, and it's coming on primarily because the prices are getting so low, and it's going to hit a parity level at some point, especially if fossil energy prices start kicking back up. So we're looking at this, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. I wanted to kind of give you a capsule summary of what we're looking at in the pipeline now in the ERCOT queue. So at the top, the list is, we have 57,000, almost 58,000 megawatts of generation in the interconnection queue, including 26,000 megawatts of wind, almost 10,000 megawatts of solar, and as of late, 644 megawatts of storage. Now, not all of this is going to get developed. There are several hurdles that a new resource has to clear before they can actually get energized and go onto the grid. And some of these megawatts have already cleared those hurdles and are actually going to be built. Some of them have not cleared any of the hurdles yet. But this is just everybody that's saying, hey, I got something, I want to build an ERCOT, and that's kind of how it breaks down. I would think that the vast majority of the rest of the 57,000 megawatts is natural gas. I think there may be one small coal unit in the queue. And meanwhile, we're still building out the grid. ERCOT, as I mentioned early on, we sort of manage the transmission planning process. It's kind of a big, sprawling process that works through stakeholder groups and then eventually finds its way to the ERCOT board and then to the Public Utility Commission. Typically a transmission project is brought to the ERCOT Regional Planning Group by one of the wires companies, one of the transmission operators. And right now, there are a total of, and we usually measure these by dollars rather than by miles of wire, because some of them are transformer upgrades or substation upgrades. Some of them are miles of wire, but it's easier to kind of calculate what's going on in dollars. So that's why we do this. $750 million worth of transmission. In the queue, not all of that will get built. Some of it will not be proven out by the engineering studies and if some of them are, like I said, they may be economic. Basically, transmission planning breaks into two categories. You have economic and you have reliability. Typically, reliability is trying to get power into a load center. Transmission planning for economics is trying to get generation out of a constrained generation pocket. So there's different criteria that go into approving those different projects. So we'll see how that plays out. One of the things that we've had to do since we started getting the big influx of wind is get better at forecasting the wind. We had a little brush with an energy emergency alert back in 2008 before we had any wind forecasting at all online. And we immediately started developing it. And as you can see, like the blue bars were 2015, and we're generally getting a lot better at it year by year. We hired a vendor to do it. They measure wind in all the various places on the grid where we have wind resources. And the way it works is, ERCOT sets the wind forecast. We then ship it out. We make it available to the wind farms. And then they submit their schedules to us, and they cannot exceed what we told them the wind was going to be. So, it's 6%, 7%, 8%. That's not great for wind forecasting, but it's a whole lot better than not having any wind forecast at all, or than what they were when we first started. So we feel pretty good about that. We have also, one of the bullet points mentions, we've also just recently implemented a grid scale solar forecasting system as well, and it'll work similarly. So one of the things we also do is we run demand response products. These are resources that can compete in some cases head-to-head with generation for providing a type of service to the grid. My roots are in DR. Jay Zarnick is too. He's here. We've spent a lot of time developing these. The red bar at the top is what we call our load resources. These are large. A lot of these guys are large industrials that are capable of instantaneous interruptions or of bringing their load off in 10 minutes based on a verbal instruction. And this is just the amount that we've actually registered. And we started with 400 megawatts back right after the market opened in 2002. We've got over 3,400 megawatts of these guys available now. We can't ever procure all 3,400 megawatts. We're capped at half of what we call our responsive reserve service. Which is in the neighborhood of 1,400 megawatts per hour of every day of the year. And that is usually filled up. It's a very, very mature, very successful demand response program. And these guys can be deployed either of two ways. They can be deployed instantaneously on a frequency excursion, or if we had what we call a slow burn type of event, we can deploy them on a 10-minute verbal dispatch instruction. The blue bar on the bottom is what we call emergency response service. And those are actual megawatts that are procured. We have, as we speak, we're about to roll into a different contract period for these guys, but right now we have something like 830 megawatts. And that's mostly demand response, but it also includes some distributed generation. It also includes a little bit of that residential air conditioning we talked about earlier. We built a section of that product that's friendlier to weather-sensitive loads. We call that weather-sensitive ERS. So it's been kind of a gateway for the first residential air conditioning demand response to make it into our markets. These guys are only asked to deploy when we are in the late stages of a grid emergency. They're our last line of defense. It was really developed following the incident we had in 2006 where we had to initiate rolling blackouts during an April event. And that's a whole different story. I don't have time. Sorry. So the next thing I mentioned a minute ago is rooftop solar, and we're keeping our eye on that. But meanwhile, we're getting a lot of new distributed generation of all kinds on the grid, but a lot of it today This, by the way, and I mentioned we operate the grid at 69,000 volts and up. That 60 kV, by the way, is a NERC threshold, so that's why I used it here. But we know that historically the vast majority of our generation, the overwhelming majority, has come from transmission-connected large central generation plants. We know that's changing. A greater share, fortunately maybe not as fast as some other markets, but is going to come out of the distribution system, which we don't operate. We cannot see these guys very well today, and we cannot dispatch them. They are not part of our market operations. They don't contribute to price formation. But what you're looking at here is the difference between the number of units and the number of megawatts from 2011, which was right after our, or during that incredible weather year, and then what we have today 5 years later. And notice that about 80% of it is what we call self-dispatched, which I'm going to call, might also be confused with the term fossil fuel, diesel, natural gas, in some cases maybe landfill gas. I mentioned that a second ago. These guys are eligible to offer into emergency response service, which I mentioned, which we talked about under the DR umbrella. Some of them can actually chase prices in the wholesale markets. They are compensated at the load zone price. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a minute about the difference between a local or so-called nodal price and a load zone price. But I mentioned a second ago, we don't get to dispatch these guys, and they come on, and effectively at the system-wide level, they have the same effect as somebody bringing a load off. They can actually reverse prices when the generators in the energy-only market are hoping to see scarcity prices materialize. They may actually cause those prices to flatten or actually reverse. There is a protocol revision in the request in the system right now that would allow them to be dispatched by ERCOT, but it is proposing to continue to settle them at zonal. So I'm going to spend a minute on this. It's a little nerdy, but I wanted to get it across because our group and ERCOT Inc., I think, expects this to become a big deal. So first thing we need to know is how much do we have? And so we've got some tools for collecting data on distributed generation. If you're over a megawatt and you inject onto the grid, and you're not registered with the Public Utility Commission as a self-generator, then you have to register with ERCOT. So that we have those numbers in that previous slide. We also see that the annual reports that the transmission and distribution service providers, sorry for this avalanche of acronyms here, I told you I was going to fail at this. They submit an annual interconnection report that lists literally every single distributed generator in their system, from a 2 kW rooftop solar unit all the way up to a 14 megawatt diesel. And they are supposed to, and they do, update the ERCOT profile codes. And I'm going to talk about profiles a little bit later, but we still maintain a profile on each of the customers in the investor-owned utility, the competitive choice area. So we know approximately at any time how many of those guys have a DG unit on site. And for the most part, the vast majority of those, especially in residential, are going to be rooftop solar. Meanwhile, I mentioned the other 25% of our market is what we call NOEs. That's another acronym, non-opt-in entities. They are required to just report the injected energy that goes to the grid for any of their units over 50 kW. We also try to follow some of the reports that they have to file with their city councils or maybe their co-op boards. That's a very difficult challenge. Point I'm trying to make here is we're struggling with DG reporting to really know what's out there and especially where it is. But given what we have, we put these numbers together. So this is kind of what it looks like today. If you look at the big pie at the top, you can see that the DG on the system today is a tiny sliver of the total generation mix. Now, that I mentioned a minute ago, we're expecting that to grow. Okay, it's almost inevitable. But right now, it's at a manageable number. And then what you're seeing down here in the bar charts are, well, I don't know what happened to my value there in the middle. Something, that's weird. I'll try to fix that. But the bottom bar is really the most important one. That's the total. This is all from the interconnection reports that the transmission utilities file with the PUC every year. About 80% of it falls into that fossil fuel category. So but that's 224 megawatts out on the right are basically all your renewables. Okay? So it's about 1,100 megawatts total. A lot of that never goes positive to the grid. A lot of that is just backup generation, maybe for some kind of critical infrastructure, maybe for some kind of an industrial facility, or I know some of all the data centers, for example, have backup gen, hospitals, etc. So I've been talking about DG, and what we're trying to work on now too is the transition from just DG as we know it, just distributed generation, to a distributed energy resource. We're seeing a lot of these things pop up in Europe. They're popping up in California, in New York State, and they may be aggregations of different types of machines. They might be a battery. That's a Tesla Firewall down there on the lower right. They may be a diesel unit. They may be rooftop solar. In some cases, they may include demand response for people moving Nest thermostats around. And there are a large number, and we've seen a lot of them come through ERCOT and talk to us, a large number of software companies that are building platforms to help manage these things, and they help move these different things around, and they can accommodate the renewable energy by maybe filling the gaps with a battery or with the DR. So it's a kind of an interesting thing. They come onto the distribution system, that moves its way up to the transmission system and say, hey, are we going to be able to deal with these guys in our wholesale markets, which we're used to dealing with people that are primarily transmission connected. We're working on this. This is going to be a big deal in the future as the DERs come to the market. They're going to develop slower here, primarily because the business case is not as strong, and the reason for that is because our prices are so low, because of the cheap natural gas and the wind. So let's talk about zonal to nodal for a minute. You guys may have heard the term nodal, and a lot of times people lose interest when I start talking about it, but it's kind of a big deal. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this slide, but what the nodal market really does is it really vastly improved the way we dispatch power on our grid. We dispatch it now to unit specific, we give unit specific instructions every 5 minutes. And when we used to give portfolio level instructions every 15 minutes. So people used to compare the zonal market, which we retired in December of 2010, to flying a 747 with only the rear view mirror as your controls. Nodal has vastly improved the efficiency of our market. Everybody agrees on that. We spent several years and quite a bit of money building it, but it's been a great deal for our markets. That congestion is better managed by figuring out exactly the impact of a single unit on a constraint versus having a whole portfolio and trying to figure out how it's going to work. So the point I'm trying to make here is Nodal is designed to meet power balance requirements and solve for congestion at the same time through these market-based base point instructions. Means is if there's no congestion on the system, the whole market's going to clear at the same price. If there's any congestion anywhere, you're going to see the LMPs, the locational marginal prices, start to vary. And then we settle the market on a 15-minute interval basis. So we take 3 sched runs of generation prices. We do a weighted average of those, and that's what the load pays for the generation at the end of a 15-minute interval. Keep all that in mind because that's kind of important for this next nerdy couple of slides. So what happens when there's congestion on the system? So here is an actual event. This happened in the Rio Grande Valley almost 2 years ago. We had to actually do firm load shedding, which we call it, which is rolling blackouts. And we had to call the transmission operators in the valley and ask for 200 megawatts of firm load shed. This is about a 2-hour span there. We had a concurrent outage of a large transmission line and a concurrently with a large generation unit. So the prices behind that constraint, where the generators that were still online were able to collect, those prices went all the way up over $1,000 for at least one of those intervals there. Other buses, these are load buses, I guess you would call them, load points on the transmission system, all of them at least $600. So they were clearing at an unusually high price. Those prices were diluted across the south load zone, though. And the south load zone, it got to maybe $170. It spiked up to about $400 for just one interval, and then everything came back down after we crossed the peak. Point I'm trying to make here is if you had distributed generation behind the constraint, that distributed generation would only see the load zone price, and it might say, hey, that price doesn't do it for me. I need a higher price. The actual generation resources, which are already getting a nodal price, they would have come on, but one of them broke that day, and that went out, and that's why the prices got so high. That's why we had to shed firm load. We don't like to shed firm load, but we had to do it that day. So this brings us to a couple of conundrums that we have with our DERs. And the first one is, I mentioned a minute ago, there's a market participant that has a proposal in the system right now to allow ERCOT to dispatch DERs, mainly DG really, but still proposing to pay them the zonal market price. That wouldn't have done us any good in the Rio Grande Valley in October of 2008 because they might not have been an efficient strike price for them. So the point I'm making here is, we spent a good deal of time, a lot of effort, a lot of money building the nodal market to bring the efficiency of locational marginal pricing to the market. But now we're seeing an increasing share of our generation mix coming from the distribution system. If we keep settling those guys on a zonal price, won't we kind of be retreating from the whole concept of a nodal market? So my group, and I can take a small amount of credit because I have worked with some really smart people, we wrote a white paper about a year ago that proposed a framework for DERs to be settled at a local price. It hasn't moved anywhere. We're kind of waiting for the stakeholder process to kind of flesh this whole thing out and see where they want to go. But we proposed a couple of categories of DERs. We call the DER light and DER heavy. Both would be eligible for local nodal prices. And DER light would be sort of passive. They would not be dispatched by ERCOT, but DER heavy would walk and talk and look just like a regular generation unit and be actually part of the price formation engine. We have another conundrum with DERs, and I mentioned all those software platforms earlier, and they can manage renewable and fossil and storage and, in many cases, demand response. We have a conundrum here to say, well, if we're trying to go to this nodal settlement for DERs, we have what we think is a challenge because the PUC rule requires load to be settled at the zonal price. This was a totally understandable decision when they were writing the nodal rule, because there were some constrained areas on the grid, and if you're going to price load at a nodal price, some people are going to have to pay more just because of where they're located. They didn't have anything to do with how the transmission grid got built out. They just happen to live there, or their business happens to be there, but their prices locally would have been higher. So the commission made a conscious decision to dilute those prices for load. What does that mean for demand response in a DER? It tells us to say, unless we get some kind of clarification that says, hey, this is a different type of load than regular load, we're going to have to exclude demand response from being part of the performance of a DER. It's a little bit of a challenge. It may find its way to the PUC at some point. I don't know. But we've identified it, and we have kind of proceeded under that assumption. So I think the last section of my deck is going to talk a little bit about retail competition and how am I doing on time, Fred? Doing okay? And then advanced metering, because I think there's some important things to go here. So those of you, if you live in Austin, maybe you've moved here from Houston or Dallas or whatever. If you lived in Houston or Dallas, you would know that there is an extremely active and very highly competitive retail electric market in those cities. Austin Energy, CPS Energy of San Antonio, they're not open to competition. Our two co-ops on either side of us are not open to competition. But 75% of our load is open to competition. There are a number of, it's very aggressive competition. You're talking about, direct mail, you're talking about billboards, you're talking about TV, radio, you name it. The football stadium in Houston is named after Reliant Energy. So our role in all of this is, and by the way, the PUC, if you've ever been to powertochoose.org, you can kind of look at how that's playing out. There are hundreds and hundreds of offerings on there. We have a major role in that retail market. We register all the customers. We're the registrar. So a retail electric provider does not own a customer until we say he does. We also are the clearinghouse for all the meter data, and I'm going to talk about meter data here in a second. But we use that meter data in settling the market, which is also one of our major roles. So advanced metering, this is a big game changer in our market, and it's starting to bear some fruit. So what happened? The 2005 Texas legislature passed a bill that said, hey, we should give the investor-owned TDSPs, transmission distribution service providers, accelerated cost recovery if they do AMI deployment, advanced metering infrastructure. So I'm trying to backfill all my acronyms. How am I doing? Thanks. Okay. Then once the law took effect, the PUC had to pick that up and move on into the rulemaking process. They did some really good things. They, of course, defined how the surcharge was going to be collected, and that's the accelerated cost recovery. The second bullet, sub-bullet down on the bottom, is what I think is the most important one of them all. I'm sorry, the second and third one. But they said every meter will be 15-minute, will collect 15-minute interval data. So that's 90, you went from 1 meter read per month to 96 meter reads per day. That's a big deal. 2,880 per month, by the way, in case you're pulling your calculators out. Even more importantly, they said, hey, we're going to use that data to settle the market. We're going to settle these customers on their actual 15-minute interval data usage. That tells us, hey, we've been keeping these load profiles alive for all of the early years of the market. They're just an estimate. They're an average estimation of what everybody who's kind of like you does with his interval, with his energy during the day. You get that 1 meter read at the end of the month, and then you extrapolate those kilowatt hours across all these profiles, and that's how we settled the market. It didn't matter what you were actually doing. The market, the settlement process assumed you were doing exactly what the guy next door and the guy next door was doing. Well, in fact, that is a discouragement to intelligent energy management. Okay, so when they went to 15-minute wholesale market settlement, that was a huge deal. And then the bottom one was, encourage dynamic pricing and demand response, and you couldn't have done that without the third one. So what do we have today? Well, we went from 0 advanced meters to 6.9 million. This all started about 2008 or 9, so we're there now. There's one of the smallest of the TDSPs is just now getting their AMI deployment underway, but literally 99% of the competitive market is covered with advanced metering now. The TDSPs have reduced meter reading costs, advanced outage detection. They don't have to guess where the outages are occurring, and it's really improved the efficiency of the retail market when somebody switches reps or somebody moves in or moves out. The reps are getting settled on their customers' actual usage, and what that means is, and one of my colleagues today said, "What do you mean by real money?" Well, real money is this: if, let's say, a rep goes into a day and they've hedged their costs based on what they think their forecast for the load that day is going to be, and if they miss that forecast, they could be short in the real-time market. What that means is they could be subject to paying some price all the way up to $9,000. We haven't got there yet, but we've gotten into the thousands. If they can move some people's thermostats, if they can drop load anywhere within their portfolio, they can reduce that their shortfall. If they happen to be long in the market, they're effectively selling that energy back to the market at the real-time price and actually profiting from it. So if you reduce load during a high-price period, it's only good things happen to the retailers. Okay, how does it benefit ERCOT? Well, we're settling the market much more accurately. And by the way, we have 3 settlement rounds for every operating day. And the first one happens 9 days after the operating day. And we have almost every single piece of that AMI meter data in for initial settlement now, which is a really good thing. So that it reduces the exposure that a lot of these retailers have in the energy markets. In addition to the AMI data, which covers the smaller customers in the competitive choice areas, all of the munis and co-ops have boundary metering that measures their usage every 15 minutes. And the large industrials have what we call interval data recorders. That's what IDR stands for. They are also settled on 15-minute data. So we're settling 99% of our total load today on 15-minute actual data. That's an incredible improvement from the old days. And the customers, of course, they can sign up at the Smart Meter Texas portal and look at their own 15-minute usage, or that in a lot of cases their retailers have developed their own portal. So I think of this as the foundation of the smart grid. So what has happened is the reps have said, hey, you know, I can make real money. And so there are a goodly number of these products now where if you sign a 2-year contract with a rep, they'll give you a $250 Nest thermostat. They'll give it to you. Now, they in some cases will say, you know, I'd like the opportunity to be able to move you around a few times this summer. And the customers usually say, that's fine, because they can always override. That's part of any of these agreements. But there's a lot of this going on, and I've asked the thermostat folks, I say, hey, how many thermostats you guys have in the field? And they don't want to tell me, but they say a lot. So there's a lot of smart thermostats, Wi-Fi controlled thermostats going into Dallas and Houston. These are going to be incredible tools for the efficiency of the market. Keep stepping on this thing. And again, that's insurance against, thanks, Harsh, insurance against wholesale market price spikes. And the next thing I'm going to show you is what's happened with the increase in the DR demand response related products and dynamic pricing products that wouldn't have been possible without the advanced metering deployment. So we started collecting data from the reps, and Jay has helped us with some of this. We started collecting data from the reps in 2013. It's a very painful process, by the way, and it's not in the protocols. It's something that they're doing out of the kindness of their hearts. But we collect lists of people that are on different price offerings, and I just picked 2 of them here. The first one is time of use, and you guys may have heard of free nights and free weekends. That's a big deal in Dallas and Houston because the energy, because of the wind blowing at night, is so cheap that they can afford to not charge you for the energy, say between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. Those are up. We have 330,000 of them as of last summer. Similarly, look at peak time rebates. Now, these are not. That doesn't mean that 500,000 people have gotten peak time rebates, but it means that those people are eligible for a peak time rebate if they met the certain conditions that their retailer put forward. 500,000, that's about, almost 10% of the market, 10% of the residential market. It's a pretty big deal. Wouldn't have been possible without the AMI deployment. So I've got last 2 slides, a couple of things my group is working on. Fred kind of alluded to future ancillary services. I didn't even do a slide for that. And the reason I didn't is because we spent 3.5 years working on it. We wrote the protocols on it and worked with the market participants to try to figure out a way to get a better set of operating reserves for the days when we have a huge amount of renewables on the system and we have a lot more ramping issues. And the market decided they weren't ready for it yet. So we had to put it on the back burner. We'll probably have to come back to it someday piecemeal. But what we do have on the table today is we have a couple of major market design enhancements. Real-time co-optimization, $64,000 terminology, and then another one called multi-interval real-time market. These are both enhancements to our real-time energy market. And what we do every day in the day-ahead market is we co-optimize, and what that means is you take all of your offers and you commit certain units to provide ancillary services or operating reserves the next day based on their cost, and the rest of that falls into the market of the energy bucket. Then what we're proposing to do is to do that in real time every 5 minutes every day. You'd be like running the day-ahead market every 5 minutes in real time, always selecting the lowest cost option for the market. That's got a ways to go, but we're still working on it. We're also working on MIRTM, multi-interval real-time market. So currently our dispatch engine, which we call SCED, Security Constrained Economic Dispatch, looks out 5 minutes. It looks at the next 5 minutes and commits units to meet the energy needs 5 minutes later. And it works great. but it could work even better, we think, if it could look out 30 minutes, because then it could pick up some units that can't maybe respond in 5 minutes, or that can't participate in SCED today because they have a minimum run time that they can't be guaranteed in SCED today, or they may have a maximum run time that we can't honor. So we're working on running some simulations on this. We'll see if this thing makes it out of the blocks probably sometime next year. We're talking to the stakeholders continuously about this. So those are a couple of deals. By the way, both of these are in use in some of the other ISOs already. And then last but not least, we've tried to enable demand response participation in SCED, in the real-time energy market. We did so in 2014 with what we call version 1, but it is limited to load-serving entities, and it is limited to controllable load resources, which means a resource that can move incrementally in either direction. So that's kind of hard for some DR. Some DR is you flip a switch and you go from whatever level to 0, and maybe you can't come back right away. Multi-interval, loads in SCED version 2, if we combined it with multi-interval, if you see my bottom bullet there, could conceivably accommodate those kinds of resources. What version 2 would also do is allow third-party DR aggregators to participate directly. They can't do that today. Today it's limited to load-serving entities, and they participate on the basis of a bid to buy. Unfortunately, we have not had any participation to date. And by the way, that's a sad story, but it's true in a lot of the other ISOs too. It's been very difficult to attract DR into the real-time energy market. There's a little bit of participation, I think, in the mid-continent ISO, but I think it's been a challenge. And I think some of the things that we're working on here might actually start crossing the threshold, but that remains to be seen. That is everything I had, and I think hopefully you all have built up a huge cache of questions for me, because I'm here for as long as you want me.
Thank you, Paul.
So one of your slides from towards the beginning of the presentation showed the hotspots for solar generation in Texas, and a lot of it was, I think, Pecos County was one of the big places. I'm curious whether the permitting process for building solar installations there is different than the rest of the state because of its proximity to Big Bend or Big Bend Ranch, or if the Endangered Species Act or other environmental protection legislation impacts the ability to build there.
So did you name a particular location you were thinking about, or are you just thinking about the interconnection process in general?
The interconnection process in general with respect to that deepest red county around Big Bend.
Yeah. So the challenge there is that there is no transmission system in the Big Bend country. You know, there's just nothing there. In fact, the only there's Presidio, Texas, is down here in kind of just before you get to the Big Bend, and there's a single radial 69 kV transmission line that serves Presidio. And about 10 years, it's owned by AEP, and about a little over 10 years ago, I think, that line would go out. They have some rough weather out there, and that line would go out so often the Presidio would go dark. Presidio had an agreement with the city across the border. They would sometimes do what we call a block load transfer, and they get served by the load by the generation in Mexico for a brief period while they repaired the line. But AEP actually pushed through a provision to get a battery down there to serve as the backup for when the line goes out of service, and that's been in place for about 11 years. But that gives you an idea of the weakness of the transmission grid. The Commission has made it fairly clear that they are not going to initiate a second CREZ project for solar, okay, or for more wind or whatever. They said CREZ is basically done. There's one more CREZ project up in the Panhandle that's underway right now. Forget where I had that. They're reinforcing one of the lines up there, but then basically CREZ is over. What that means, and this is the biggest challenge, I think, to answer your question, is they're going to have to go through the transmission planning process and prove out the value of that solar on the basis of production cost modeling. It has to be an economic outcome that's better for the market than what's there today. In other words, it's cheaper to build that transmission line to enable that zero fuel cost solar power to get onto the grid than it is to serve the load we have today with $3 natural gas. So that's really the challenge. Now, as far as the environmental impacts and all of that, that's not something we get involved in, but we do run the interconnection studies and make sure that the facilities that they're planning to interconnect to are capable of handling the capacity on that solar farm. I hope that answered your question. I'm not sure I got it also. Okay, thanks.
Hi. Yes. First, thanks for your talk. And hi.
There you are. Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. So you had mentioned that perhaps the market wasn't ready for the ancillary service redesign, and I just was curious if you could briefly expand upon that, if it was certain groups
Sure.
or what exactly
I thought about
happened.
putting that slide in because what we really were doing was breaking up our current ancillary services and making them more granular, and then we were actually adding one new one, which we called fast frequency response, which would have been probably friendly to really fast-acting resources like batteries. But the implementation of it carried a price tag. I mean, anytime we have a protocol revision, especially one that, any protocol revision, but one that ERCOT sponsors, we have to put a price tag on it before it even can start moving through the system. We were estimating in the $12 to $15 million range. That's nowhere near what we spent to build Nodal, but it's a bigger price tag than your average protocol revision, right? A lot of the market participants, especially on the generation and power marketing side right now, are feeling the squeeze from low gas prices and just basically flat energy prices for most hours of the year. I don't think that they wanted to go to that expense at this particular time. And one of the main reasons, and one of the main data points that they used to justify that position was they said, hey, ERCOT, there's a NERC metric called Controlled Performance Standard, CPS-1, and that's how well you keep the grid in balance on a daily basis, hourly, 5-minute basis. And our scores have only improved. I mean, this is primarily due to the nodal market design, but we have the best CPS-1 scores we've ever had. They said, hey, this doesn't prove that you need ancillary services. So, thing is, we don't know what the grid's going to look like in 5 years. That's why we did future ancillary services. Like I said, we're going to have to go back to some of those things. We may have to do them one at a time rather than all at once. And it may have been the Big Bang Theory that sank it too. So.
A quick question. In the event, I guess it was August 8th and 14 when the major power failure occurred. What actually caused that? And does the nodal system seem to me to be a lot more resilient to that kind of a situation? And what kind of things could we do to ensure that, as best we can, that we can guard against another large failure?
You're talking about the Rio Grande Valley incident?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So where was that? Can't remember. Shoot, I had it somewhere. But anyway, no matter where you are, you're always vulnerable to that. So that was really we operate under N-1. So that's a NERC term also. Jay, what does the N stand for in N-1? Normal -1? I don't know. But -1, that means you lose a major transmission facility, you could still keep the grid reliable, okay? What happened here was we had an N-2 situation. We lost a transmission line and a big generator. And there's, by the way, new transmission being built into the Rio Grande Valley as we speak. So that's going to be a long-term solution to the problem you've identified. But that particular day, we had an N-2 situation. We had two big things happen. And so, yes, that put us just behind that constraint. This was down in the lower Rio Grande Valley. Behind that constraint, we didn't have any other solution than to drop load, and so we had to call the TDSPs.
What caused that?
What
caused the genset to fail?
The generator to fail? I don't know. They probably blew a valve or something. I really don't know. It was an exceptionally warm day in October, which is right around this time of the year, and I do believe the temperature was exceeded. And you also have, there may have been. October 1st is what, 2 days from now. That's usually the season when the generators start to take planned maintenance. So there may have been another unit down there that was out on planned maintenance. This one got put out on a forced outage, a combination of the things. So I don't know that. I'm kind of speculating there, but But basically what you had was an N-2 situation with a transmission grid that had already been identified as being a area that needed an improvement, and there's already a line under construction. It just wasn't finished yet. So, okay. Hi.
Thanks for a great presentation. I have a question regarding the pricing of the grid and particularly the cost recovery of the poles and wires. Are you expecting that the advanced metering is going to help you price the grid more efficiently, particularly if you expect more distributed generation coming online? So people who are using the grid at those peak times paying more for it.
Yeah. So, you know, I don't know if I caught all of that, but we have an enormous number of moving parts on our grid. And DG, I spent quite a bit of time talking about, but I think your question was kind of designed as, hey, is an influx of distribution level resources going to pose more of a challenge for us to meet peak demand?
More in the sense of if you have households that have a great deal of PV on the rooftop, but they're still using a large amount of energy at peak times,
Gotcha.
7 p.m. at night,
Okay, gotcha.
are they going to be paying for that capacity?
So rooftop PV, so one thing, and you know, you guys have probably heard of Pecan Street, and you may have, I think Bert was here a few weeks ago, right? So they've done some great research on this, and you know, the solar panels peak at the time the sun's highest typically, because they're fixed, for the most part residential rooftop solar. So that's going to peak around 2 in the afternoon. By the time we get to the ERCOT peak, which is usually around 5 o'clock, that solar has come down quite a bit, and that's when everybody's coming home and their air conditioners are on and maybe they start cooking and all the other stuff. So you've led into a really good area that I feel very strongly about, and that is that West Texas, see if I can remember where all my maps are. Yeah. So, you know, this is some really good solar way out here. So if you put grid scale solar out in West Texas, that's a time zone away from Houston and Dallas, right? That is a great place to be generating, and that is going to align itself with the ERCOT peak much better. So if we're going to get a lot of solar, I hope a lot of it goes out there. You know, and I know Austin Energy is developing a community solar program where you, instead of putting it on your rooftop, because maybe your roof doesn't face the right way or you got a tree or whatever, you can buy some solar panels as part of a larger installation that they're doing somewhere in the area. I've asked Austin, I say, hey, why don't you guys put that out in Pecos County? You know, then I'd buy in because it's going to have more value. You know, it's going to command a higher price in the market, and it's going to do a lot better for serving peak demand. I think if you've followed the California experience, you know, they have what they call a duck curve, and it's when all the solar is coming off right at the time all that load is ramping up. They don't have this kind of west to east geographical benefit that we have. So they've got some real challenges out there. They're going to meet it with storage and all kinds of other stuff, but I hope I got close to answering your question. Catch me afterwards. Okay.
Here.
Hi.
So do you see a capacity market being developed in the future, or that's completely out of the picture?
I refuse to answer on the no, that was a long and very intensely debated issue at the PUC. And ultimately they decided, hey, you know, the energy-only market has worked so far. We did have some thin years, but we never fell below our target reserve margin. And there were signs that even with the relatively lack of high scarcity pricing in the market, people are still continuing to build. So, you know, we're still seeing new units come on, and some of them are what you would call firm generation, or I mean, it's not all wind and solar, is what I'm saying. There's a lot of natural gas, combined cycle, and simple cycles coming on. So the jury is, for the long term, is out on your question. For the near term, it's not on the table.
I can probably do it. What do you see as your largest barriers to implementing SCED version 2? Are they software, are they regulatory?
Loads in SCED version 2? You're talking about demand response in SCED? That was my last slide?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, no, that's okay. Whoa. Yeah, this one, okay. So we had a subgroup at ERCOT that worked on this bullet point here to get the third-party DR aggregators eligible. This challenge that we have a big challenge there in that unlike the FERC jurisdictional ISOs that are operating under the provisions of FERC Order 745, which says you shall pay demand response the full LMP. Okay, so in other words, if you're a demand response asset and you're in the real-time market and you get an instruction from the ISO to drop your load, you avoid the cost of that energy, and you also get paid the same thing the generators are getting paid during that interval. That is a non-starter so far in the ERCOT market. The ERCOT stakeholders don't like that idea. The Public Utility Commission has said they don't really like it. So we've operated under the provisions of, why?
Why? Seems fair.
I refuse to answer on the grounds that it may incriminate me. But I think they're calling it a double payment, Fred. They say, hey, you already avoided the cost of the energy, and we're going to pay you for avoiding the cost of your energy. So.
Is it not analogous to the net metering debates going on in Nevada on the demand side? Is that kind of like the same?
So you talk about the net metering issue, yeah.
What was that, analogous?
Sort of, I would say. But anyway, I didn't want to lose that thought. If we could figure out a way to get the third-party DR aggregators into the market, if you didn't ever have very much volatility in your energy market, then there would never be an incentive here. But if we ever get to a day where we're having a lot of high price spikes in a $9,000 energy-only market, what we came up with and what the stakeholders have thus far at least said is okay, is we developed what we call a proxy G. So it's LMP minus G is what the Commission has asked us to work under, and the stakeholders have asked us to work under. It means you get your LMP, but you have to subtract a value of what you would have paid for that generation. Well, if you paid 10 cents a kilowatt hour and the market clears at $9, that's $8.90. So we said, hey, if we can enable this, there might very well be an incentive there. Okay. It's hard. There are a lot of moving parts in this thing, and we didn't finish it, and it never made it into the form of protocol revision, but we have a framework that we could go back to. Actually, what the market is telling us now is that this is actually the more important piece of it, and that's going to the multi-interval SCED to be able to accommodate blocky loads and loads that have what we call temporal constraints that are maybe a minimum runtime or a maximum runtime. So.
One last question and we'll wrap it up after this.
Okay.
So we've talked a lot about sort of the next 5 years sort of plans. And so I was curious what you were thinking about for, say, 2030 or 2035, because, generators are going to be around that long. Sort of put a different way, we've been talking a lot about sort of distributed resources and current stakeholders in opposition to them. So is there is the future an evolutionary one? Is it a revolutionary one? What's the story?
Well, I think we're fortunate in ERCOT. It's going to be more evolutionary than revolutionary because, because of just the conditions we have in our market. Our prices are suppressed by having a lot of zero cost generation on the system and low cost gas generation on the system. California and Hawaii those are revolutions, okay, and Germany. But one thing we found is our resource adequacy group looks out and they put what we call our capacity, demand, and reserve report together, and it looks out 10 years. Well, year 5 to 10, the further you get out, the less valuable it is. One of the things that we had to do in the last couple of years, 2 or 3 years, was completely overhaul how we do load forecasting. We used to base it entirely on an econometric model where basically you look at non-farm employment and other main economic indicators, and the load would track that literally almost exactly year to year. That broke. It happened to break in 2008 when we had the Great Recession, so we thought, well, it's just an anomaly. But no, we found out it's permanently broken. So we went and we overhauled it completely with using a neural networks system. Don't ask me any more about neural networks, but it's the effect of more demand response and especially energy efficiency and energy efficient appliances, energy efficient air conditioning compressors, and to some extent solar. But, I mean, I used an example of when I bought my first big flat screen TV, the guy was trying to sell me a plasma, and I said, well, wait, I like that LED there because I like the picture better. It had a little sticker down on the bottom that said $12 on it. I said, what's that $12? He goes, that's your annual cost to run this TV. I go, really? He goes, yeah, that's based on 5 hours a day at 11 cents a kilowatt hour. It's $12 for the year. And I said, well, wait, what if I bought that plasma you're trying to say? Well, it'd be about $55. I said, well, what if I bought that plasma 10 years ago? He said, that'd be about $155. So that's how much the TVs have improved. That's just one example. So, you know, it's try projecting what's going to happen in the next 20 or 25 years to energy efficiency, and you know, you can see where the load forecasting starts to fall apart. So, but we are focusing on the next 5 much more intently, and we think we've got some great tools for that. So, but I think I know where you're going, and I hope you're right. So.
Thank you, Paul.
All right, thanks a lot, everybody.
And if anybody's interested, you know where Paul and I are going to be in about 15, 20 minutes.